I still remember the exact sound of my father's laughter that October evening in 2018. It wasn't the warm, loving laugh I'd heard when he watched his favorite sitcoms or when my older brother Jake cracked a joke at dinner. No, this was different. This was the kind of laugh that cuts through you like a knife, cold and dismissive, the kind that makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. I was sitting at our kitchen table in our modest two-story house in Naperville, Illinois, staring at the SAT score report that had arrived in the mail that afternoon. The numbers seemed to mock me from the page. 1180. Not terrible, but not great either. Definitely not Harvard material, as my guidance counselor had gently suggested during our last meeting. "So, how'd you do, kiddo?" Dad had asked, settling into his usual chair with his evening coffee. He was still wearing his work clothes, the blue button-down shirt and khakis that made him look like every other engineer in the Chicago suburbs. His graying hair was slightly disheveled from running his hands through it, something he did when he was stressed about work deadlines. I hesitated, knowing what was coming. "I got an 1180, I said quietly, sliding the paper across the table toward him. He picked it up, adjusted his reading glasses, and that's when it happened. The laugh started as a small chuckle, then grew into something more substantial. "Seriously, Nick, an 1180? He shook his head, still smiling in that condescending way that made my stomach turn. "Your brother scored a 1520 on his first try, remember? We celebrated at that steakhouse downtown." Of course I remembered. How could I forget? Jake's success had been the talk of our household for weeks. Photos of his acceptance letters to multiple top-tier universities still hung on our refrigerator like trophies. "I know it's not great, but I can retake it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Mrs. Peterson said lots of students improved their scores the second time around. That's when he said it. The words that would haunt me for months but also fuel a fire in me I didn't even know existed. "Oh, honey," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "She couldn't even pass this exam properly the first time. You think Harvard's going to want someone who can't handle a standardized test?" He laughed again, softer this time, but somehow even more devastating. "Maybe you should consider community college first. Work your way up slowly." Mom walked into the kitchen at that moment carrying a load of laundry. She must have heard the conversation because she shot Dad a warning look. "David, that's enough," she said firmly. "Nick worked hard for that score." "Did she, though?" Dad asked, looking between us. "I mean, really? Because Jake was pulling all-nighters, studying constantly. Nick here spends most of her time on her phone or watching Netflix with her friends." The accusation stung because it wasn't entirely untrue. I had been more focused on my social life than my studies, but hearing it said so bluntly, so dismissively, made me feel smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. "I'm going to my room," I mumbled, grabbing the score report and rushing upstairs before anyone could see the tears building in my eyes. I closed my bedroom door and leaned against it, finally letting the tears fall. My room was my sanctuary, decorated with posters of my favorite bands and photos of friends from school. But even here, surrounded by familiar things, I felt lost. I looked at myself in the mirror above my dresser. Average height, blonde hair that I'd inherited from Mom, blue eyes that everyone said were pretty but that I'd never thought were special. I looked like any other suburban teenager. Nothing remarkable, nothing that screamed Harvard material. But as I stared at my reflection, something shifted inside me. Maybe it was the humiliation of my father's words, or maybe it was the realization that I'd been living down to everyone's expectations, including my own. Whatever it was, I felt a spark of something I hadn't experienced in years: determination. I pulled out my phone and started Googling. How to improve SAT scores. Harvard admission requirements. Study strategies for standardized tests. Article after article filled my screen, each one offering hope that maybe, just maybe, I could prove everyone wrong. The next morning at breakfast, the tension was still thick in the air. Dad was reading the newspaper, occasionally glancing at Jake, who was home from Northwestern for the weekend. My brother was everything I wasn't. Confident, academically gifted, and clearly Dad's favorite. "So what's the plan, Nick?" Jake asked, not unkindly. "Are you going to retake the SAT?" I looked up from my cereal, feeling all eyes on me. "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I'm going to retake it, and I'm going to get into Harvard." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Dad laughed again, that same dismissive sound from the night before. "Harvard? Nick, be realistic. Even if you improve your score by 200 points, which would be impressive, you'd still be below their average." "We'll see," I said, standing up from the table. "We'll see." As I walked to school that morning, the crisp October air filling my lungs, I made a promise to myself. I was going to prove my father wrong. Not just about the SAT, but about everything. I was going to show him that his youngest daughter, the one he'd written off as average, was capable of extraordinary things. I just had no idea how hard that journey was going to be, or how much it would change me in the process. The first month of my Harvard mission, as I'd secretly dubbed it, was a complete disaster. I'd bought every SAT prep book Barnes & Noble had to offer, downloaded 3 different study apps, and even signed up for online practice tests. But motivation, I quickly learned, was very different from actually knowing how to study effectively. I remember sitting in the school library during lunch surrounded by prep books that might as well have been written in a foreign language. The math section was particularly brutal. I'd stare at algebra problems that Jake probably could have solved in his sleep, and I'd feel that familiar wave of inadequacy wash over me. "Hey, Nick, what's with all the books?" My best friend Sarah dropped into the chair across from me, unwrapping her sandwich. She was one of those naturally smart kids who never seemed to stress about grades, which made her both enviable and frustrating. "I'm retaking the SAT, I said, not looking up from a particularly confusing geometry problem. "Trying to get into Harvard?" Sarah nearly choked on her sandwich. "Harvard? Nick, no offense, but isn't that a bit ambitious?" There it was again, that word, the same doubt I'd heard in my father's voice, now coming from my best friend. "Why is everyone so sure I can't do it?" I asked, finally looking up at her. "It's not that you can't do it," Sarah said carefully. "It's just, you've never been super focused on academics before. Remember sophomore year when you almost failed chemistry?" She was right, of course. I'd scraped by with a D+ in chemistry, and that was only because Mr. Rodriguez had taken pity on me after I'd stayed after class begging for extra credit assignments. But that was the old Nick. This was the new Nick, the one who was going to prove everyone wrong. "People change," I said, closing the prep book with more force than necessary. "I'm going to figure this out." But figuring it out was harder than I'd imagined. At home, I'd lock myself in my room for hours, trying to work through practice problems. The house would be quiet except for the sound of Dad's TV downstairs and Mom's occasional footsteps in the hallway. Sometimes I'd hear Jake on the phone with his friends, casually discussing their internships and graduate school plans, and I'd feel that familiar pang of being the family disappointment. 2 weeks into November, I took my first practice test since starting my intensive study routine. I was confident, maybe even excited. I'd been putting in 3 hours a day, which felt like a lot to me. I'd memorized vocabulary words, practiced math formulas, and even worked on essay structure. The score was 1190, 10 points higher than my actual SAT score. I stared at the computer screen in disbelief. All those hours, all that effort, and I'd improved by a measly 10 points? I closed my laptop and lay down on my bed, staring at the ceiling. Maybe Dad was right. Maybe I was kidding myself. The next day at school, I was walking to my locker when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Miss Johnson, could I speak with you for a moment?" I turned around to see Mrs. Chen, my AP literature teacher. She was a small woman in her 50s, with graying hair always pulled back in a neat bun and glasses that made her look like she'd stepped out of a classic novel about dedicated teachers. "Sure, Mrs. Chen," I said, following her to her classroom. She closed the door behind us and gestured for me to sit in one of the front row desks. "I've noticed you've been distracted in class lately. Your last essay was well below your usual standard." I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I've been studying for the SAT retake." "Ah," she said, settling into her desk chair. "And how's that going?" I hesitated. Mrs. Chen had always been kind to me, one of the few teachers who seemed to see potential in me that I didn't see in myself. But admitting failure felt too raw, too real. "Not great," I finally admitted. "I'm starting to think maybe I'm not cut out for this." Mrs. Chen studied me for a long moment. "What exactly are you trying to achieve, Nick?" "I want to get into Harvard," I said, the words feeling both bold and foolish coming out of my mouth. If I expected her to laugh or look skeptical, I was wrong. Instead, she nodded thoughtfully. "That's a significant goal. What's your current approach to studying?" I described my routine, the books, the apps, the isolated hours in my room. As I talked, I noticed Mrs. Chen's expression growing more concerned. "I see," she said when I finished. "Nick, can I ask you something? When you're studying math, do you understand why you got a problem wrong, or do you just look at the answer and move on?" I thought about it honestly. Usually I just look at the answer and try to remember it for next time. "And when you're reading comprehension passages, do you actively engage with the text, or do you just read it and hope you absorb it?" Again, I had to be honest. "I just read it and hope for the best." Mrs. Chen nodded, but not in a judgmental way. "Nick, you're working hard, but you're not working smart. You're studying like someone who's always been naturally good at taking tests, but that's not your strength. You need a different approach." She pulled out a piece of paper and started writing. "I want you to try something. For the next week, I want you to study for only 1 hour a day. but I want you to follow this method exactly." She handed me the paper. On it, she'd written a detailed study plan that looked nothing like what I'd been doing. Instead of racing through problems, she wanted me to focus on understanding why I got things wrong. Instead of passively reading, she wanted me to summarize each paragraph in my own words. "This looks like it'll take forever," I said, scanning the list. "Quality over quantity," she replied. "Trust me on this." That night, I sat at my desk with Mrs. Chen's study plan in front of me. It felt weird to only study for an hour, especially when I knew Jake had spent entire evenings buried in books when he was preparing for his SAT. But I followed her instructions exactly. I started with 5 math problems, but instead of trying to solve them quickly, I worked through each one step by step. When I got one wrong, I didn't just look at the answer. I worked backwards from the solution, trying to understand where my thinking had gone off track. It was frustrating. That 1 hour felt longer than the 3 hours I'd been putting in before, but something was different. By the end of the session, I actually understood why I'd made the mistakes I'd made. Over the next week, I stuck to Mrs. Chen's plan religiously. 1 hour a day, focused and intentional. I started keeping a notebook where I wrote down every mistake I made and why I'd made it. I began to see patterns in my errors, things I'd never noticed before. The following Friday, Mrs. Chen asked me to stay after class again. "How did the week go?" she asked. "It was hard," I admitted. "But I think I'm actually learning instead of just memorizing," she smiled. "Good. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. Why do you want to go to Harvard?" The question caught me off guard. Because it's the best school in the country." "That's not what I asked," she said gently. "I asked why you want to go there." I thought about it, really thought about it. "Because my dad doesn't think I can," I said finally. "Because everyone thinks I'm the family disappointment. Because I want to prove that I'm more than they think I am." Mrs. Chen nodded. "Those are powerful motivators, Nick. But I want you to think about what you want to prove to yourself, not just to them." As I walked home that evening, her words echoed in my mind. What did I want to prove to myself? For the first time since this whole journey began, I realized I wasn't entirely sure, but I was beginning to think that maybe, just maybe, the answer was more important than I'd realized. December arrived with the kind of brutal Chicago cold that makes you question why anyone ever decided to build a city here. But I barely noticed the weather because something incredible was happening. I was actually getting better at this whole studying thing. Following Mrs. Chen's method religiously had started to pay off. My mistake notebook had grown thick with observations, and I was beginning to see patterns not just in my errors, but in the test itself. The SAT wasn't just testing what I knew, it was testing how I thought. And for the first time in my life, I was learning to think like a test taker. "Nick, dinner!" Mom called from downstairs. I glanced at the clock on my desk. 6:30 p.m. My 1-hour study session had turned into 2 hours without me even realizing it. But unlike before, when studying felt like torture, this felt engaging. I was actually curious about why I'd gotten that last reading comprehension question wrong. I bounded down the stairs, probably looking more energetic than I had in weeks. Dad was already at the table, tie loosened, looking tired from another long day at the engineering firm. Jake was home for winter break, which meant our family dinners had returned to their familiar dynamic of him sharing stories about college, while I mostly listened. "So I got my fall semester grades," Jake announced, cutting into his chicken. "Dean's list again." "That's wonderful, honey," Mom said, beaming with pride. "Your father and I are so proud of you." Dad nodded approvingly. "Keep it up, and you'll have your pick of graduate programs." I took a bite of my mashed potatoes, waiting for the familiar sting of being overlooked. But something was different this time. Instead of feeling diminished by Jake's success, I felt motivated. Like his achievements were proof that excellence was possible in our family, and maybe I could find my own version of it. "How's the SAT prep going, Nick?" Jake asked, and I could tell he was genuinely trying to include me in the conversation. "Actually, it's going really well," I said, and I meant it. "I've been working with Mrs. Chen on developing better study strategies." Dad looked up from his plate, eyebrows raised. "Oh? What kind of strategies?" I hesitated. Part of me wanted to keep my progress private, to protect this fragile new confidence I was building, but another part of me wanted to share what I was learning. "Well, instead of just doing lots of practice problems, I'm focusing on understanding why I get things wrong," I explained. "And I'm keeping a notebook where I track my mistakes and look for patterns." "That's smart," Jake said, nodding. "I did something similar when I was studying for the MCAT practice tests." Dad looked skeptical. "How much have your scores improved?" "I haven't taken a full practice test yet," I admitted. "Mrs. Chen says I should wait until I've mastered the individual sections." Dad said, returning to his dinner. I could practically hear him thinking that I was probably just delaying the inevitable disappointment. But I knew something Dad didn't know. 2 days earlier, I'd taken a practice math section, just the math, and I'd scored 650. That was a 100-point improvement from my original score in that section alone. I hadn't told anyone yet because I wanted to make sure it wasn't a fluke. After dinner, I went back to my room and opened my notebook. Mrs. Chen had suggested I start each study session by reviewing what I'd learned the day before, and it had become one of my favorite parts of the process. I could literally see my progress on the page. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Want to come to the movies tonight? Brad's going to be there." 6 months ago, I would have dropped everything for a chance to hang out with Sarah and hopefully talk to Brad Morrison, who I'd had a crush on since sophomore year. But now, looking at my notebook and the practice questions I'd planned to work through, I found myself typing back, "Can't tonight, studying, have fun." I stared at the text for a moment before sending it. Who was I becoming? The old Nick would never have chosen studying over a social opportunity. But the new Nick was starting to understand something important. Every choice was a step toward either the person I wanted to become or the person I'd always been. The next morning, Mrs. Chen asked me to stay after class again. "How are you feeling about taking a full practice test?" she asked. "Nervous," I admitted, "but also excited. I think I'm ready." She smiled. "I think you are too, but I want to prepare you for something. Your score might not be dramatically higher yet. The strategies we've been working on take time to fully integrate. Don't get discouraged if you don't see the jump you're hoping for." That weekend, I took my first complete practice test since starting Mrs. Chen's method. I set up in the kitchen early Saturday morning when the house was quiet and I could focus completely. 4 hours later, I submitted my answers and waited for the computer to calculate my score. 12 and 50. I stared at the screen, not quite believing what I was seeing. I'd improved by 70 points. It wasn't Harvard level yet, but it was real, measurable progress. I printed out the score report and ran upstairs to my room, closing the door behind me. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my best friend. "Sarah, you're not going to believe this," I said when she answered. "What? Did Brad finally ask you out?" "No, better. I got a 1250 on my practice SAT. There was a pause. "Wait, seriously? That's amazing, Nick. I thought you were kidding about the Harvard thing." "I wasn't kidding," I said, and for the first time, I truly believed it myself. That evening at dinner, I decided to share my news. "I took a practice test today," I announced as we were clearing the dishes. "How did it go?" Mom asked, looking hopeful. "I got a 1250. The silence that followed was different from the dismissive quiet after my Harvard announcement. This was surprise. "That's a significant improvement," Jake said, and I could tell he was genuinely impressed. "Not bad," Dad said, though I could see him calculating in his head. "Still need to get it higher for the schools you're targeting." "I know," I said, "but it's progress." Later that night, I was in my room when I heard a soft knock on my door. "Come in," I called. It was Mom. She sat on the edge of my bed, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "Not just for the score, but for sticking with it. I know it hasn't been easy." "Thanks, Mom," I said, feeling a warmth spread through my chest. "You know," she continued, "your father wasn't always the confident person he is now. When he was applying to engineering school, his own father didn't think he was smart enough. He had to prove himself too." This was news to me. Dad had always seemed so sure of himself, so convinced of his own abilities and skeptical of everyone else's. "He loves you, Nick," Mom said. "He just has a hard time showing it sometimes. I think he's afraid of getting his hopes up." After Mom left, I lay in bed thinking about what she'd said. Maybe Dad's doubt wasn't just about me. Maybe it was about his own fears, his own experience of being underestimated. The next Monday, Mrs. Chen asked me to stay after class once more. "I have a proposition for you," she said. "There's a student in my other AP Lit class who's struggling with reading comprehension. She's great at math and science, but the verbal sections are killing her SAT score. Would you be interested in tutoring her?" "Me? Tutor someone?" I was genuinely surprised, but I'm still learning myself. "Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who remember what it's like to struggle," Mrs. Chen said. "And explaining concepts to someone else is one of the most effective ways to solidify your own understanding." I thought about it. The idea of helping someone else, of being the person who could offer guidance instead of needing it, was both terrifying and thrilling. "Okay," I said. "I'll try it." And that's how I met Jessica Rivera, a quiet junior who was brilliant at calculus but fell apart when faced with dense reading passages. Our first tutoring session was awkward and uncertain, but by the end of it, something had shifted. Not just for Jessica, but for me. As I walked home that day, I realized something important. I wasn't just learning to take tests better. I was learning to believe in myself. And for the first time in my life, that felt like the most important lesson of all. January in Chicago is brutal, but I barely noticed the snow piling up outside my bedroom window. I was too focused on what had become the most important date on my calendar, January 28th, my SAT retake. After 3 months of intensive preparation, it was finally time to put everything I'd learned to the test. Tutoring Jessica had turned out to be one of the best decisions I'd made. Not only was she improving, her reading comprehension scores had jumped by 80 points, but teaching her had forced me to articulate strategies I'd been using instinctively. Every time I explained why a particular answer was correct, I was reinforcing my own understanding. "You're like a completely different person," Jessica had told me during our session the week before. "When Mrs. Chen first suggested you as a tutor, I thought she was crazy. No offense." "None taken," I'd laughed. I probably would have thought the same thing, but Jessica was right. I was different. I could feel it in the way I approached problems now, the way I broke down complex reading passages, the way I didn't panic when I encountered a difficult math concept. I'd developed something I'd never had before: academic confidence. The morning of the test, I woke up before my alarm. My stomach was churning with nerves, but it was a different kind of nervousness than I'd felt before my first SAT. This time, I was nervous because I actually had something to lose. I'd worked too hard to let anxiety sabotage me now. I went through my usual morning routine, but everything felt heightened. The shower water seemed warmer, the coffee Mom made tasted stronger, even the drive to the testing center felt more significant. Dad had offered to drive me, which surprised me. "You've been working really hard these past few months," he said, as we pulled into the parking lot of Naperville North High School, where the test was being administered. I'm proud of you for sticking with it." It wasn't exactly an apology for his earlier dismissiveness, but it was the closest thing to encouragement I'd gotten from him in months. "Thanks, Dad," I said, grabbing my calculator and ID from the dashboard. "Nick," he called as I was getting out of the car. "Good luck." The testing room was filled with other students, most of them looking as nervous as I felt. I found my assigned seat and arranged my pencils and calculator exactly the way I'd practiced. Mrs. Chen had taught me the importance of routines and consistency, even in small things. As the proctor began reading the instructions, I closed my eyes and did the breathing exercise Mrs. Chen had shown me. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. I visualized myself working through problems methodically, the way I'd been practicing for months. The test began and something magical happened. For the first time in my academic life, I felt like I belonged there. The math problems that had once seemed impossible now felt like puzzles I could solve. The reading passages that had once overwhelmed me now felt like conversations I could follow. I moved through the sections with a calm focus I'd never experienced before. When I encountered a difficult problem, instead of panicking, I used the strategies I'd learned. I eliminated wrong answers systematically. I looked for context clues in reading passages. I managed my time carefully, just like I'd practiced. During the break, I overheard 2 students complaining about how hard the math section was. "That last problem was impossible," one of them said. But I had solved that problem. I was sure of it. When the test was over, I felt cautiously optimistic. I hadn't felt like I was drowning, which was how I'd felt during my first SAT. But I also knew that feeling good didn't necessarily mean I'd done well. I'd have to wait 2 weeks for my scores. Those 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I threw myself into helping Jessica prepare for her own retake, partly to stay busy and partly because I genuinely enjoyed teaching her. She was scheduled to take the test in March, and her confidence was growing with each session. "I never thought I'd say this about reading comprehension," she told me one afternoon, "but I'm actually starting to enjoy it. You make it seem like solving a mystery." "That's exactly what it is," I said, realizing I'd never thought about it that way before. Every passage is a puzzle, and every question is a clue. At home, the tension was palpable. Mom kept asking if I'd heard anything yet, and Dad pretended not to care while obviously checking his phone more frequently than usual. Even Jake, who was back at Northwestern, had texted me asking about my scores. February 10th arrived with a snowstorm that had half the city shut down. I was home from school, sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop, when I realized the scores might be posted. My hands were shaking as I logged into my College Board account. "Score available" flashed on the screen. I stared at it for a full minute, afraid to click. This was it. This was the moment that would tell me whether the last 3 months had been worth it, whether I was actually capable of the transformation I'd been working toward. I clicked. 1480. I read the number 3 times before it sank in. 1480. I'd improved by 300 points. My math score was 740. My reading and writing was 740. I was in Harvard's range. I was actually in Harvard's range. I screamed. I literally screamed with joy, right there in my kitchen, loud enough that Mom came running from the laundry room. "What happened? Are you okay?" she asked, looking panicked. I got a 1480, I shouted, turning the laptop screen toward her. Mom, I got a 1480. Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, understanding, and then pure joy. Oh my God, Nick, oh my God! She grabbed me in a hug that nearly knocked me over. I'm so proud of you. We were both crying and laughing at the same time when Dad walked in from his home office, looking concerned about the noise. What's going on? He asked. Nick got her SAT scores, Mom said, wiping her eyes. Show him, honey. I turned the laptop toward Dad, watching his face as he read the numbers. His expression went from mild curiosity to shock to something I'd never seen before. Genuine pride. 1480, he said softly. Nick, that's incredible. It's in Harvard's range, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Dad nodded slowly. Yes, it is. He looked at me for a long moment, and I could see something shifting in his eyes. I owe you an apology, Nick. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about what you could accomplish. It was the first time my father had ever apologized to me for anything, and it meant more than I could express. That evening, Jake called to congratulate me. I always knew you had it in you, he said, though I suspected that wasn't entirely true. So what's next? Are you really going to apply to Harvard? I already did, I said, realizing I hadn't told my family about my early applications. I applied to Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, and a few other schools back in December. You applied without telling us? Mom asked, looking surprised. I didn't want to make a big deal about it in case. I trailed off, not wanting to voice my fears about rejection. Nick, Dad said, his voice serious, I want you to know that regardless of what happens with college admissions, what you've accomplished here is remarkable. You set an impossible goal and you achieved it. That night, I called Mrs. Chen to share the news. I'm proud of you, she said. But I'm not surprised. You discovered something important about yourself these past few months. What's that? I asked. That you're not just smart, you're resilient. And resilience will take you further than raw intelligence ever could. As I hung up the phone, I looked at myself in my bedroom mirror. The same face looked back at me, but something fundamental had changed. I wasn't the girl who had to prove she wasn't average anymore. I was the girl who knew she was capable of extraordinary things. The SAT score was just the beginning. Whatever happened next, I knew I could handle it. I had proven to myself that I could set an impossible goal and achieve it. And that knowledge, I realized, was worth more than any test score. Now, I just had to wait for Harvard to decide if they agreed. March arrived with an unusual warmth for Chicago, as if the city itself was ready for new beginnings. But I barely noticed the weather because I was living in a constant state of anticipation. College decision letters were coming, and every day felt like holding my breath underwater, waiting to surface. I'd heard back from a few schools already. Northwestern had accepted me, which felt incredible considering it was where Jake went. University of Illinois had offered me a scholarship, but the letter I was waiting for, the one that would either validate everything I'd worked for or send me back to Earth, hadn't arrived yet. You need to relax, Jessica said during one of our tutoring sessions. She'd taken her SAT retake in February and was waiting for her scores, but she seemed less anxious than I felt. You've already gotten into amazing schools. I know, I said, but even I could hear the tension in my voice. It's just, Harvard was the goal, you know? It was what I was working toward when my dad said I couldn't even pass the exam properly. Jessica nodded, understanding. Over the months we'd been working together, I'd shared more about my family dynamics than I'd intended. She'd become not just a student, but a friend, someone who understood the pressure of trying to prove yourself. Whatever happens, she said, you've already proven him wrong. You've proven everyone wrong, including yourself. She was right, but it didn't stop me from checking the mail obsessively every afternoon when I got home from school. Mom had started leaving college letters on the kitchen counter, creating a small pile of thick envelopes and thin ones, each representing a different future possibility. On March 28th, everything changed. I was walking up our driveway after school, my backpack heavy with homework I probably wouldn't be able to concentrate on, when I saw Mom's car in the garage. She was usually at work until 5, so seeing her home early sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea and an expression I couldn't read. In front of her was a single envelope, thicker than the usual bills and advertisements that filled our mailbox. It came today, she said simply. I looked at the envelope and my heart stopped. The return address read, Harvard College, Office of Admissions, in simple, elegant lettering. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. How long have you been staring at it? I asked, dropping my backpack by the door. About 2 hours, Mom admitted with a nervous laugh. I called your father. He's on his way home. My hands were shaking as I picked up the envelope. It was thick, which people said was a good sign. but I'd learned not to trust those kinds of superstitions. I turned it over, looking at my name written in formal script. Miss Nicole Johnson. Should I wait for Dad? I asked. That's up to you, honey. This is your moment. I heard the garage door opening and Dad's footsteps in the hallway. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, still wearing his work clothes, slightly out of breath like he'd rushed home. Is that? He started. Harvard, I confirmed, holding up the envelope. He sat down across from me, and for a moment we all just stared at the envelope like it might spontaneously combust. This was the family that had sat around this same table 6 months ago, when Dad had laughed at my dreams and I'd run upstairs in tears. Now here we were, united in nervous anticipation. Nick, Dad said quietly, before you open that, I want you to know something. Regardless of what that letter says, you've already accomplished something extraordinary. You've shown determination and growth that I didn't think was possible. It was the most emotional I'd ever seen my father, and it meant everything to me. But I still needed to know what was in that envelope. I slid my finger under the flap and carefully opened it, pulling out the folded letter inside. I unfolded it slowly, my eyes scanning the first line. Dear Nicole, congratulations. It is with great pleasure that I inform you of your admission to Harvard College. I stopped reading and looked up at my parents. Mom had her hand over her mouth, tears already forming in her eyes. Dad was staring at me with an expression of pure amazement. I got in, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I got into Harvard. The next few minutes were a blur of hugging and crying and laughing. Mom called Jake at Northwestern, and I could hear his whoops of excitement through the phone. Dad kept shaking his head in disbelief, saying Harvard over and over like he was trying to make it real. I need to call Mrs. Chen, I said suddenly, realizing that none of this would have been possible without her guidance. Of course, Mom said. Call everyone you want to call. Mrs. Chen answered on the second ring. Nick, I was hoping to hear from you today. I got in, I said, and then I started crying again. Mrs. Chen, I got into Harvard. Oh, Nick, she said, and I could hear the emotion in her voice too. I am so incredibly proud of you. But you know what I'm most proud of? What? That you learned to believe in yourself. That's going to serve you well at Harvard and everywhere else you go in life. After I hung up, I called Jessica. Did you hear back from Harvard? She asked immediately. I got in, I said, still hardly believing it myself. Oh my God! Nick, that's amazing. I'm so happy for you. Jess, I said, I want you to know that helping you taught me as much as any studying I did. You helped me get here too. That evening, we went out to dinner at the same steakhouse where we'd celebrated Jake's SAT score years earlier. But this felt different. This wasn't just about a test score or even a college acceptance. This was about transformation, about proving that anyone could change their story if they were willing to work for it. I want to make a toast, Dad said, raising his glass of wine, to Nick, who taught this family something important about not underestimating people, and who taught me that being wrong can be the most beautiful thing in the world when it means watching your daughter exceed every expectation. As we clinked glasses, I thought about that October evening when Dad had laughed at my dreams. I thought about all the late nights studying, all the mistakes I'd learned from, all the moments when I'd wanted to give up but pushed through anyway. Dad, I said, remember when you said I couldn't even pass the exam properly? He winced slightly. I remember, and I'm sorry I said that. Don't be sorry, I said, surprising myself. If you hadn't said that, I might never have been motivated to prove you wrong. And in proving you wrong, I proved something to myself that I never would have discovered otherwise. What's that? He asked. That I'm capable of anything I set my mind to. That limitations are just starting points, not stopping points. Later that night, I sat in my room looking at the Harvard acceptance letter. In a few months, I'd be leaving Naperville for Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'd be starting a new chapter of my life as a Harvard student. But the most important transformation had already happened. I pulled out my phone and opened a new note. I wanted to write down this moment, this feeling, so I'd never forget it. Today I learned that the most important person to prove yourself to is yourself. Everything else is just bonus. I looked at myself in the mirror one more time. The same face looked back at me, but I saw someone completely different now. I saw someone who had dared to dream impossibly big, and then done the work to make those dreams reality. Tomorrow, I'd start thinking about dorm rooms and course catalogs and all the practical details of starting college. But tonight, I just wanted to savor this moment. The moment when the girl everyone had underestimated, including herself, pulled out her Harvard acceptance letter and changed everything. The girl who couldn't even pass the exam was going to Harvard. And that girl was me.